Transport train on the former Great Northern Railway line from Londonderry approaches the major railway junction of Portadown. Just one day later, the line would be closed forever, the victim of public apathy, underinvestment, and government policy. The carefully tended track would be ripped up and hundreds of loyal workers dismissed. Portadown's fine Victorian station on the site of the original Ulster Railway terminus was the hub of the system, serving one of the most important interchanges in Ireland. Situated beside the broad River Bann, it was the point where the line, known to all railwaymen as the Derry Road, turned westwards. But many travellers began their journeys at Great Victoria Street in Belfast. This impressive station at one time offered a very wide range of destinations, from Bundoran, Cavan and Clonus to Castlewellan and Cookstown. But now in the 1960s, choice was more limited. By this time, many trains from here were diesel units, some inherited by Ulster Transport from the Great Northern Railway, which had pioneered the use of rail cars. But steam haulage was still common for the longer passenger journeys and for freight. The Ulster Transport Authority, which now ran all train services, had been set up by the Northern Ireland government in 1948 with the intention of coordinating road and rail transport, but making each of them pay its own way. 10 years later, it took over all of the property of the Great Northern Board north of the border. Travelling south from Belfast through Lisburn, Lurgan and the gently rolling countryside in between, express trains could maintain high speeds on the well-graded double track. From Portadown, the former Great Northern Main Line continued south to Dublin. Enterprise expresses here were often worked by the powerful three-cylinder VS compound engines, such as number 207 Boyne, which travelled thousands of miles every week to and from Amiens Street. Many Great Northern engines were named after the rivers, mountains and birds of Ireland, and indeed with their elegant lines and mournful calls, they themselves became very much part of the landscape. When the company was split between the transport undertakings on each side of the border, many of the engines retained their original names and colours, while the divided staff remained very much Great Northern men and women, no matter what their political allegiance. A junction at Gora Wood led down the steep gradient into Newry town. Then over the canal and onto the very scenic section alongside Carlingford Lough by way of Narrowwater Castle into the port and popular seaside resort of Warren Point. Until 1957, a line originally part of a more extensive system had gone from Portadown to Armagh by way of Rich Hill. But this track had fallen in hard times and was now merely a siding to a factory. For a would-be Clonus Express, this really was the end of the line. Fortunately, however, the Derry Road trains could still make their way towards Dungannon, cheerfully following the main line as far as the goods yard south of the station and, just past the signal cabin, turning sharply to the right, directly towards the west. The character of the line suddenly changed. It was as if the engines and their crews scented freedom. From the brash speeds and busy towns of the main line, it was into a quieter world of little stations and friendly staff. Annachmore was the first stop. At one time, goods traffic in peat, potatoes and cattle sustained this tiny spot, but by 1965 it had just the occasional passenger. For a period, this route was important enough to have double track laid, but the second line was removed in the 1950s. Werner's Bridge had fared even worse than Annaghmore, as trains didn't stop here now. Then it was over the dark and once navigable Blackwater into True and Moy. In 1956, railway staff here had starred in a BBC television film which forecast a bleak future for railways in Northern Ireland. Many more changes had occurred since, none giving them any confidence that things were going to improve or that their own job prospects were looking any brighter. Then the line skirted the little Drumlin Hills, but finding one just too big, tunneled under it just before entering Dunne. This was a busy station in a good location near to the town centre with frequent passenger trains. Parcel service to here on these trains was important, with delivery faster than by road transport. For heavier goods, the yard under the Beach Valley Bridge to the west of the station had extensive sidings. In the yard, the former Cookstown branch now had a junction. Formerly, this line joined half a mile beyond the town with its own signal cabin, but had lost its status, carrying occasional goods trains only to and from Cool Island, where there were extensive brickworks and Northern Ireland's only working coal mine. From here, the line had once led to Cookstown's double station, where interchange of goods with the former Derry Central line had been possible. Once past Donaghmore, just a few miles on, and looking very run down and untidy, the long, slow climb up to Pomeroy began. Surroundings became increasingly barren on the approach to Ireland's highest station. Trains often stopped here to take on water, but most of the former freight traffic had ceased. This part of the line was very busy during the war years, carrying stone foundation for Northern Ireland's airport runways from sidings at Carrickmore. 10 years after the war was won, the station, a mile from the village, lost its battle for survival. Then the long descent on the notoriously difficult Carrickmore bank led to the little 6-mile cross station close to the main street. Only 2 miles further on was Beera, with its unusual station building near the east end of the village. This line had been built by the famous engineer William Dargan for the Portadown, Dungannon and Omer Railway Company, reaching here by 1861. Just over the Drumragh River on the approach to Omer, the short branch curved off to the Market Yard goods station, one of 2 in the town and well placed on the Dublin Road near the gasworks. The passenger station on the Drumore Road at the upper end of the town was entered by a tight curve at the south signal cabin leading directly to the platforms. The station buildings here had good facilities for passengers with heated waiting rooms and a small shop. Omagh had had an important junction with the Enniskillen and Bundoran lines until 1957. In fact, this was the earliest route, part of the Londonderry and Enniskillen Railway, later called the Irish North Western, which for a short time terminated at Fintona. When the line was extended to Enniskillen in 1854, Fintona became a branch, later served by Dick, the famous one-horsepower locomotive. The importance of these branch lines to Omagh lay in the enormous quantities of freight which they'd carried, particularly live cattle for export. Some had originated across the border on the privately owned Sligo, Leitrim and Northern Counties Railway, and then up through Enniskillen for onward transport. So much shunting was needed in Omagh that an engine and crew were kept for this purpose. As well as the nightly goods service for County Donegal, the Irish Republic's transport company, CIE, ran special pilgrim trains from Dublin to Lough Derg, with buses used from Omagh station. The railway in Omagh had been the making of the place. A once remote town had grown substantially through its presence, and it had given reliable and stable employment to many generations of townspeople who looked on their jobs with pride. A career at the station had prestige, and it had discipline. It was not merely a job for life. It might even be handed on to a capable son.
You know, railways are really a family tradition. Fathers and sons, brothers and uncles, so on, right down the line over the years that this railway has been made. It was built here some 112, 113 years ago. And it's all been a family tradition, and they've had no interest in any other employment other than the railways, and it has reared many good families.
Sadly, 5 railwaymen had been killed here in 1950 when they were hit by a train while ballasting track between the platforms. Heading northwards from Omagh, the passenger could enjoy a fine river journey for most of the way right up to Derry. In the town, the Camoan and Drumrah had come together to become the Strool, while just by the next station, further tributaries transformed the ever-expanding river into the Mourne. Newton Stewart served an area stretching from the Donegal border to Gorchin and the foothills of the Sperrin Mountains. From here, the river was at its best. At Victoria Bridge, passengers for Castlederg changed to buses. For 50 years, a steam tram did the trip, but this had long since ceased to run. Nestle's factory here was served by a private siding. Sion Mills had a siding also into Herdman's linen mills. The pretty village was matched by the well-kept station. Then it was over the Mourne, shortly to become the Foyle, and the Lifford Road level crossing into Strabane. This had been a major junction between the 3-foot gauge County Donegal Railway and the Irish standard gauge 5'3" systems until 1959. Now, in 1965, it was still a busy freight interchange for Donegal. In 1863, a standard gauge branch from Strabane had linked it with the twin towns of Stranorlar and Ballybuffet, but by